Hello, welcome to McGowan Soundworks. My name is Phil McGowan. I'm a mixing and recording engineer based in Los Angeles, and today we're going to be going over a cue from episode 310 of Star Trek Picard. This is the finale episode of the entire series. This cue on the soundtrack is called The Missing Part of Me. It's one of my favorites from probably the entire series. It's a very big moment in the finale. Now, big spoiler alert before I reveal the working title of this cue. It kind of gives away the story. So if anyone still wants to watch the show, hasn't seen it yet, doesn't want to know the story until you've seen it, maybe skip this video until you've seen the whole series. So the working title of this was called Picard Saves Jack, which is a much more straightforward title, but not nearly as interesting. Our showrunner, Terry Metalis, renames pretty much all of the soundtrack cues before they went out for release on the album versus what the working title was when we were actually working on the show. This is the, 16th cue. This is 310M16, Picard Saves Jack. This cue was written by Stephen Barton, who is one of the two composers from this season of Star Trek Picard. Frederick Weidman was the other composer, and perhaps I might go over one of Freddie's cues later on sometime and do another video with one of his cues from an earlier episode. But this was the first cue in the show that features our 80-piece full orchestra that we recorded at Warner Brothers Eastwood Scoring Stage up in Burbank. It was a real pleasure to have everyone in the room together. It's really kind of a rare thing these days, even though that's how it used to always be done. We had everyone there except for percussion, so strings, triple winds, which is 12 players, so 3 people on each section. Brass, which was 6 horns, 2 trombones, 2 bass trombones, 2 tubas, and 3 trumpets. And then 2 harps, left and right, so they're sort of stereo harps in front of the string section. And then a single piano cellist player. She went back and forth and doubled both. So yeah, it was a really fun session back in July of 2022 that we did this. Let's dive into it. So first of all, now that I'm talking about the orchestra, let's look at the layout here. So this is how I had the room arranged for this session. So first violins on the left, a little bit further into the seconds, then the violas, then cellos here, and basses sort of behind the cellos. The piano cellist was sort of, there's a hole made here by the way that I had the violin set up, so I thought this was a good place for her. There actually was another gobo over here as well, so there's sort of a V-shaped gobo that was giving a little more isolation to that, but honestly, they're all in the room together. I don't need a ton of isolation on these things because Steven's going to balance things from the podium. There also were gobos in between the brass and woodwinds here that are not listed on this room layout. In the back to the left are the French horns. Now, normally I'd have them in an arc, 6 in a row, but since Warner Brothers is oriented the skinny way like this instead of wide like Sony would be, we stack them there with the back desks the back players on risers. The woodwinds are dead center with the back in risers here, and then off to the rear right are the low brass. So here are 2 trombones, 2 bass trombones, 2 tubas in the back here, and then the 3 trumpets up on a riser in the back. And then the harps here you can see with a little bit of gobo in front of them for their microphones are hard left and right, which is a kind of a nice stereo harp effect. But yeah, that's how the room was laid out. And then if we look at my input list, these are the microphones that I used. I recorded, 58 channels, which is not super crazy for this big one orchestra. I've seen people go more. And the only reason I would use more microphones is if I was doing 7.1 or Atmos, I'd just have more room mics set up for those things. So the tree were these M50s, which are Flea 50s, which are a reissue M50 that Jason LaRocca owns. So I was renting these from him. He's had them modded, and they really sound phenomenal. The outriggers are my typical Sennheiser MKH 800s in Omni. The surrounds, which were, I think, mounted, they were behind the outriggers. So the tree was sort of, over the conductor here. The wides were left and right, kind of, behind the string section here. And then the surround mics would have been just behind there, just much, much higher up. So they're kind of the same width as the outriggers, but then just very high and the most ambient microphones. And then 3 mics per violin section, front, back, left, and right. I think I had the front mic was kind of up here for both these sections, and then just sort of, a spot mic sort of loosely covering the back, sort of 4 people or 2 desks per mic is kind of how I did that. Those are all MKH 40s, which is one of my favorite string spots. Then the violas were also MKH40s, but an earlier version, these 406Fs, which is something that Warner Brothers has had for a long time. They're very similar to MKH40s, but I ran out of 40s because I used more microphones in this session than the earlier session, so I had to switch to something different. But that was just front, mid, back, which is pretty straightforward. Cellos, I basically had one mic per desk, so we had 8 cellos, so basically sort of just over their music stand facing down at them were the cello mics, and those were all U67s. And then the contrabasses all got their own mic because I really wanted to get, the low-end presence of the low end from the basses, so those were kind of, I don't know, in front of them, sort of at the bottom of the body, not pointing directly at the F-hole of one of the F-holes, but sort of, in that vicinity on a short stand. Then each harp I mic'd with 2 Sheps Mark IV capsule. They're CMC6 with a Mark IV capsule, which is a really nice mic. Also works great for string spots. And just a high and low on each. So just sort of, yay there and there. So the high mic is covering the higher strings, and then the lower mic is there. I probably could just use one of them, but it's kind of nice to have, if we need to bring out, the lower notes, which is sometimes a little bit quieter on a harp. And then the woodwind section. So I always do an overhead or overall microphone or microphone. So they were sort of, left and right. If we look at the room layout here, there's probably one roughly here and one roughly here, maybe 8-9 feet or so, just kind of covering the whole section. And that's really the predominant woodwind spot. So they just kind of cover the whole section. And those are M49s, which are wonderful annoying microphones. And those are set to wide cardioid. And then normally with the smaller orchestra that only had double winds, so there were 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons. Now we have 3 of everybody. Instead of using 3, a microphone on each person like I do with a double woodwind section, I just kept the same mics and figured I'd just sort of put, a left and right pair over each section, and that's enough of a close. Mostly this is for if you need a little more definition on the winds, or especially if there's any solos. So there's a lot of woodwind solos in the Picard soundtrack. So it's good to have those microphones there so I can really dig out flute solos and oboe solos and English horn solos and so on and so forth, or clarinet solos. So yeah, those are just sort of, in between. There's probably a mic here and a mic here, sort of, in between the 3 players. And that would cover them enough. So I used the rest of the MKH40s, and then I figured the U67 would be nice for the low end of the bassoons. And I had them available. Warner Brothers has, I think actually they have like 24 U67s. That they've had for, decades, which is really fun. Moving on to the brass, the horns. Now, normally for the brass overall and the horns, I would use M49s, but they only had 2 there, so I used 149, which is a newer version. Still great sounding mics, not quite as nice as the M49, but still a great microphone. So the front, left and right was kind of in the front here, probably there and there, also, around 8 feet. I think the horn front, the woodwind overalls, and the low brass microphones were all kind of at the same height, just kind of covering those sections broadly. Then I also use horn rear microphones. So these were kind of, back here, kind of tucked back. It's a little bit interesting with them stacked this way. When they're in an arc, you kind of get a more even sound because the back mics are kind of behind the whole section. And did I have those in wide cardioid, I believe? I should have had them in wide cardioid. Oh, just cardioid. Well, that's fine. I think it's because it was a narrower section. But that gets, since horns, when they're playing them, the bell faces backwards. If you want a little bit more of a brassier tone or a little more brightness from the horns, having the mic behind them can give you a little bit more of that. And I just blend that in a little bit for a little bit more clarity in the horns. Then the brass overheads or overalls, they're kind of over to the right over the whole section. There's probably one here and one here, also at 8 feet, kind of just covering the whole section. And then a mic for every instrument in the brass. So for the trumpets, I used Royer 122s, and then these old RCA 44Bs for the trombones and bass trombones. And then the tubas, Warner Brothers awesomely has 2 251s. I think I don't know if they're vintage. I think they might be reissues. I'm not exactly sure. But they're great sounding mics, and those are just kind of just pointing right into the bell of the tuba. The tuba spot is probably about one of the most isolated spots you'll get in an orchestra session because it literally is just in their bell. I mean, a couple feet above. You don't want to go too in the bell, but those are quite nice. And then finally, the piano. I mic'd with a pair of TLM 170s, high and low. If I didn't have brass, I probably would have used 251s in there, or C12s are really nice, or M49s are really nice in piano. But since I was kind of running out of microphones, I just used TLM 170s, which honestly is one of my favorite go-to, kind of sounds great on everything microphone. I can use them for string spots, for brass spots, for room mics. They're great drum overheads, great for vocals, great for VO overdub, all sorts of stuff. TLM 170s are incredible. Then I also use one just in the back of the Celeste, just a single microphone. Yeah, so that's the 58 mics. Preamps, I use, this is the Grace M802, which is remote controlled at Warner Brothers. There's a little remote in the control room, so I can control it, and the actual preamp is out on the floor. Just the room mics are in there. They have 16 channels of them. I guess I could have used more, but there wasn't really a whole section that I could have used them for, so I just used them on the room. And then the ribbon mics here, since they need a little bit more gain, they have 4 channels of these AEA pre's, which are kind of custom made for preamping ribbon microphones. So I put their vintage ribbons in there on those AEAs to get a little more gain out of those. The Royers, since they're a newer ribbon, don't really need that extra gain that the vintage RCA mics do. Then the rest of the channels was just using the preamps on the Neve 88RS, which is, you know, a phenomenal console and a phenomenal sounding preamp there. Yeah, so that's kind of a little bit about the recording of this session. Now let's switch over to the mix session. Pretty typical if you've seen my other videos of how it's laid out. I'm not going to go too crazy over the session overview, but I have my guide tracks at the top, which is the dialogue, ADR, and effects is what they gave me. All mono. I didn't get stereo effects for some reason this time, but that's just a rough guide track for me to listen to what my mix sounds like against the very, very, very rough. It's basically just production audio. You know, this ADR is very rough if there's even anything in there. Oh, it looks like at the end here, maybe there's a little bit of an ADR line. And then the sound effects are just what the picture editor put in there. This is not usually anything that the sound team has actually done, so I'm not really hearing final sound effects. It's just sort of whatever the picture editor cut in just to kind of get the idea of what's going on sonically. The reference track, I got some VCAs, so there's 2 passes of orchestra here. So this is my overall sort of VCA ride. I'm actually going to shut this off for now while we look at the orchestra. And then I have a folder for each stem. So these are the stems that I delivered for Picard. There were, what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 5-1 stems is what I gave the dub. And I organize everything by stem. These are just regular old folders. I don't really use routing folders. There's really no reason for me to, because I have buses inside of them, and it would require more buses and so on and so forth. So it's just not something that I really use yet. But yeah, so let's move on and start with the orchestra. So here's the orc. Here's the 58 channels that I recorded. The blue tracks here is the main pass, which is pretty much everything. And then this pass here was just the short string pass in the middle. There's sort of an ostinato that goes throughout that we overdubbed just for mix control. So we technically used to be a stripe, so it wasn't the same players playing on top of themselves. It was just the high strings playing that part that we striped, so I could really dig it out in the mix. And then I deactivated all the microphones we didn't use. Down here, I turned off all of the samples. I didn't use any samples with this big of an orchestra. So these are the samples from Stephen's rig, which is just separated by section. And then what else we have here? So there's just one flute. We used more winds. It was orchestrated for more woodwinds than was actually programmed for, but in Stephen's Mockup, there was only flute. And then the fake harp here, which is all deactivated. There is this verb throw thing that Stephen did, which we'll take a look at. Which actually I just sent directly to a reverb. So just to give a nice, you'll see in the actual final how that works. So yeah, here's the orc. I guess we'll go to sort of a middle section here that has something going on. Yeah. So I have all my processing bypassed here, and we go down to the buses here. I turned off all my bus processing for now, and all the reverbs have been muted just for now. And at the moment, we're just going to listen to the tree for a little bit. So this is really, when you're mixing orchestra, a lot of time we really rely on the room mic. So if you turn the tree, the outriggers, and the surrounds on, that's probably 85% of the sound you're going to get is really just that overall broad capture of the room. So here's what the tree sounds like, and I'll just start to solo and unmute the other room mics so you can kind of get an idea of what they're contributing. So that's just the tree. Here's the outriggers. It's a lot less definition, but just nice width. The tree and the outriggers. And then the surround mics, which as you can hear are very ambient. Here's all the room mics. So, as you can probably tell, that's kind of broadly the most of the sound that you're going to hear in the orchestra recording. Oh, hi, Tessa. My mix assistant, Tessa, just got up from her nap. So then moving on to the string section, the violins, as you can see, I'm not using a whole lot of their spots. They're usually about down there, -30, unless I need them for definition when they're playing short, marcato, staccato, so on and so forth. But briefly, we can just listen to what those sound like. I guess we'll go here where they're actually playing. So that's the violin spots for the first and the seconds. And you can hear the horns are right behind them, so there's a lot of bleed, but that's just kind of how it is. The only way to get more isolation that really would be to overdub the horns, but this sort of recording, the idea was Stephen's going to balance it from the podium, so I don't really need to dig out strings too much because he would have told the horns to play quieter, the violins to play louder at the session, which is really the way you should be producing orchestral sessions, is getting it sounding right as close as possible, and the mix is just enhancing things, just sort of giving definition and clarity to certain things. So there's that. The violas here. A fair amount of isolation on those. The cello spots. There's the basses. So you can hear the basses are quite close. They're quite present. Here's all the string spots. Which is very violin light because the violins are really coming through the room mics just fine. I don't need to use many of their microphones. Moving on. I can't remember if both harps are playing here, but here's the harp spots. So she has pretty good isolation. Let's see, I can't remember if the second harp... Oh, I think here we have two harps. Just nice texture going on underneath things. And then carrying on woodwinds. Let's see what's going on with winds. I don't think they really play here. Let's go to the end here. I believe the very big end of this cue, there's more woodwinds going on. There you are. So that's the broad overall mics that are just over top of them. Here, let me add all the close mics. So that's just the very close mics. And there's the whole woodwind section. Okay, just a little definition on those. Brass, these are the horn microphones, so they're belting here, so you should be able to hear plenty of good things here. So this is the front microphones. So it's just the front and then the rear microphones. You can hear how much brassier those are, how much more high end you have on those. Here's them together. All right, and the low brass now. Here's what those microphones sound like. So that's a pretty good broad overall sound of what the entire low brass section sounds like with the trumpets. And those have a fair amount of level on them. Trumpets. Not really. I don't really use trumpet spots very often unless there's solos or something because they are another instrument. Violins, piccolos, trumpets, those higher, frequency instruments really come through the room just fine usually, so I don't typically need quite as much of a spot mic definition on them. But here are the trumpet spots. They're pretty isolated. because those are, I mean, they're literally right in front of their bells, so they're relatively isolated. Then we'll check out the trombones here. I use a bit more of, just to get a little more of the low end sound here. But it's very bright. So if you have too much brass spots in, you just get that buzziness of them, especially the bass trombones. So that's those. You know, brass spots. That's the thing too. You know, the spots on their own aren't the greatest sounding thing, but they just give you a little bit more definition if you want to bring out that section or bring out a little more definition on the sound of that section. So here's our tuba spots. I think this is the first time I've had two tubas. Maybe not. So those are those. Undo, get that level back. And then finally the piano. So there was no, she never played celeste in this, so that's just totally deactivated, as you can see. But at the end of the cue here, there is piano going on. So here's the piano mics. A little funky there in the edit, but in the whole mix, you don't really notice that. Yes, so that's an overview of all the microphones. Here's everyone together in this very big section at the end. All of the microphones, no EQ, no reverb just yet. Here's just the room. So you can hear that's most of the sound. And here's just the spot microphones. So a lot of definition. You wouldn't want to just use this. It's not nearly as grand sounding. It's just the room. And here's all together. There you have it. There's the orchestra. Now let's look at some processing. So I didn't do a ton on this, as I recall. Let's see on the room mics here. We'll turn on these EQs. If that key command will work. So I have this 88RS over here. Just taking out a little bit of high mids and a little bit of, but barely. I mean, I'm barely touching it. Just a little bit out of the tree. A little more out of the, because, you know, there's a little bit more of a sort of a, mid-range, low mid-range kind of build-up or mid-range on the outriggers. So a little bit heavier EQ, but still, you know, not crazy drastic. And then there was a little bit of a hump there. So that room, that's probably just where Warner Brothers has a bit of a hump. I did a high Q, just one notch, whatever that is. I don't even know what it is. It's probably 1 dB, 1.5, something like that. And then the surrounds, similar to the sort of outrigger, since they're in the same place, probably getting the same kind of information. So if we just solo the rooms, that's with EQ, no EQ. Yeah, so just sort of, you know, giving a little more clarity. Everything was just getting a little built up, starting to sound this way with the mid-range. Just sort of, you know, unveiled the mask a bit. These Oxford EQs, I'm just using these for sort of just low end if I need to filter out the low end of the room because it's rumbly. If I have a lot of gain on like a, you know, high string harmonic or something, I automated these up. But I don't think I did that on this cue at all. No, there's no automation on this Oxford. But I always have this ready. I can just go here and like say there's a lot of rumble here. Turn the whole room mic group on, and I can just sort of automate the low end filter there. But I did not do that here. Then, oops, Pro Tools is slow today. And then on the spot mics, I just have a Pro Q. Honestly, most of the time, let's turn those all on. It's probably just filtering. By and large, you can kind of see here in the violins, filters. You know, I didn't do any EQ there. The cellos, I guess I dipped a little mid-range, but -3. It's nothing super heavy. just little. I don't have to go over all of these. The basses I did a little bit more just to sort of smooth them out. But again, it's 2.5, 1.7, and then just since they're so close, you get sometimes if I bring the basses up, you get a little bit too rosiny, kind of buzzy sound. So I just roll off a little high end. But again, it's very gentle. That's on all the contrabasses. The harp, I think it just had a little bit of a resonance around 300, and I did the same on all of them. Woodwind's just a filter. It looks like the rest of it's mostly just a filter. Tubas, I guess I gave a little bit. I just wanted to get a little more warmth out of them. So, but again, plus 4-ish at 40. Just kind of real gentle stuff. I try not to go too crazy with spot mic EQ. So that's the channel EQs. And now if we go down to the end here, and the same here, this overdub. If you want to hear what that sounds like, it's just this string overdub here. Now you can see here I have the violin spots up because of what they're playing. This definition's really nice. That's without the violin spots. A little more presence, but it's subtle. There's that versus that's right. Actually, this is an overdub because we did it in an earlier session. This is actually with the smaller orchestra. So the first half of the day at Warner Brothers, we recorded just a 65-piece orchestra all in the room together. So we did this string overdub first. You can see it's take 65 here versus these are in the 80s or what have you here. Of the take numbers of the full orchestra. So yeah, this actually was overdubbed orchestra. So that's a smaller string section though. There's 2 players per section fewer on this session than there were with the full 80-piece orchestra. So yeah, I'm remembering it's been almost a year since we did the session, so I'm recalling now what this was. But yeah, so that's what that overdub is. And then all the settings are the same. All the EQs would be the same, the pans. The levels would have started out the same, but then I just brought those violin spots up for a little more definition. So those 2 make up the orc. Here we'll just sort of work on this section a little bit. Then down here on the bus, I have just some EQ. Again, this is the broad EQ of the whole bus. A tiny bit just because it got a little harsh in the upper mids sometimes. Then the low mids, this is more just sort of the room builds up. Every room has this. I don't think I've ever mixed any live orchestra where I don't have some sort of a notch at the low mids here just to sort of clear up the low mid sort of region of things. So there's that. The 31102, this is my go-to broad orchestra EQ. I use it pretty much always, and it's almost always set like this to start. Sometimes I'll put the high shelf down to 10. In this case, it was just 12, just for a little air, little openness. But again, see just the first notch, a tiny bit. 1 notch down at 700 just to clear up a little bit more of the low mids, and then a tiny bit of warmth at 60. So that adds some. And then I'm also adding a lot of gain on this, so you're going to hear the orchestra get a lot louder now with that turned on, just to get over all of the synths and things like that. This Pro MB I use, again, just that sort of same area that I dipped in the Pro Q. But instead of EQing this down more, I like to use this multiband so that only when the woodwinds and the violins are getting really strong in the high mids, that just suppresses them a bit. I'm not sure if we'll see when I play back at the big section if it even touches it. It's set pretty conservatively. And then I love Gullfoss. Gullfoss has been a hit with a lot of people recently, but the tamer covers at 15%. Brighten I turned down by 25% because I feel like it adds too much brightness typically. And that's just, barely, just sort of, I don't know. I turn it on, it sounds a little nicer. It's just doing a little something nice. So let's listen to that section with the bus processing on. Here's with it off. So it's just a little duller, but still nice sound. Just a little more clarity. Like this EQ, not doing a ton. Really, the most of the tone you're hearing is this. Pro MB, I mean, barely kisses it. And you barely hear it. That's really, there's some other cues probably where they got a little bit bigger. Let's actually keep going where that section gets really big. What is that, 28? And here with the Gullfoss here. Very subtle on the Gullfoss. I don't know. Almost can't hear it, but there's just a little something, just tiny little bit though. But that's how a lot of people like to mix, is just little tiny bits of things. Now looking at orchestra reverbs, my typical array here is my outboard lexicon. So I send out stereo here. This goes outputs of my rig to a HDIO AES. And then I have 5 channels returning here. So this returns from my outboard box, which is over here. It's a Lexicon PCM 96. It looks like 2.46 is the RT with 65 milliseconds of pre-delay. The high cut's like 5,000 or 3,000. It's kind of hard to read from here. But it's kind of I start with medium random Hall 3. That's kind of my go-to orc reverb. I mean, I'm not the first person to use that. That's kind of a classic film score orc reverb. But yeah, just starting with this Altiverb is the sort of subtlest thing. You kind of hear that decay there. It's just a little extra room. I honestly probably don't need it as much for this. I typically use a lot more of this if I have recordings from Nashville or from Eastern Europe where they're in a much smaller room and I want to get a bigger scoring stage sound. But this is, just a little bit. Barely doing anything, but it kind of helps, especially with edits when you smooth over crossfades and things like that. Just if there's a weird fast edit, it gives a little more decay, but it's super subtle. Then adding the Lexicon here, I'll start dry and then unmute it. Fair amount of that. Yeah, I'm sending a lot here. -6, that's pretty high on the send. Altiverb's at -3. And there you can hear that's the cinematic verb. Yeah, so those are the kind of the main 2 reverbs. This is definitely a wetter score. Stephen and both Terry Metalis, the showrunner, has some music background and is aware of reverb and things like that. So we were trying to lean more towards the sort of Bruce Botnick sound from the 80s and 90s with Jerry Goldsmith, which were typically quite wet on the orchestra. So this is probably not quite as wet as the 90s mixes, but heading that direction. Then the other verbs here, this Stratus I use for short strings sometimes. In this case, I don't know if I use this at all in this project, unless it was a really, really sort of heavy action cue. I maybe would have used that, but it's not used in this session at all, I don't believe. No, I just used the Lexicon here, and -10 is typically my send level for that Lexicon. Now across all of these, and these are all ganged together. So when I move these, they kind of move all across the entire thing. I don't really mess around too much with sending more or less from different microphones unless I have a reason to. Typically, they're all linked together like that. Then the special sauce here is what is actually used pretty heavily in this cue, which is this Symphony. I don't know where I started from, but I started with a preset, tweaked it, and called it PM Dreamy Orc. It's just, it's 6 seconds. It's just this super soupy, ambient, kind of dreamy sounding orc reverb, and I use it here and there. So if we look at the send here for that's the Symphony. I use it at the top here. Let's put the entire guy on. Where there's this beautiful horn solo by Dylan Hart, who is our first chair horn player on all of our sessions for the entire show. And then this middle section, it gets a little bit dreamy, sort of just, dreamy strings. So I started it a little higher, then wrote it down. And then at the end, where they're big and they're playing the short strings, things like that, I'm not using any of it. But here's what that sounds like. Let me start with it muted, and then I'll turn it on partway through his solo. Yeah, so you can hear that's quite a bit of extra tail. And then I like to automate the send down. I guess I use it here too. Because we'll see later, there's a lot of synths and synth choir and things like that going on here. It's sort of a dreamy section. But then when the theme came in there, na, 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 it was a little too much, so I just wrote it down a bit. And there's that super long tail, which is something Stephen specifically wanted there. I normally wouldn't let orchestra ring out like that, and this was a reason. But that's where this little 4 verb stem came in. So this is just the string samples that are all together, printed together, and are intended to feed my reverb. So this is going directly into that symphony, dreamy symphony reverb there. And here's what just that sounds like. So just gave a little bit of extra push into that reverb, so because it really was just supposed to glue over and space this transition here before the orchestra comes back in. So yeah, that covers everything. The LFE here, I'm sending a little bit from the tuba microphones here and a little bit from the contrabass mics. That's the only source that feeds this bus here. I used to use low ender. Now I've been using Pro Sub. It's a great sounding low frequency generator, 60 to 90, -10 on both. No direct sound. So it's just sub harmonics that are being generated. It goes straight to the sub. Put a little compression on there with this Oxford compression. This is a channel strip I came up with years ago, and I haven't really touched it. And then I filtered it out just because there's no reason to have anything above 110 or so going to the sub. I do feed a little bit to the front here. So this send here is going to the LCR, and the divergence is 0, so it goes equally to all 3 channels, and just -20, just so it's not purely in the sub. There's a little bit going into the front channels as well. This is really more of a theatrical thing because in movie theaters, the screen channels are full range, so you would hear these low frequencies coming from the screen as well. So I just like to reinforce it a tiny, tiny bit, but predominantly it's going, completely to the sub, and then I just sort of ride this or set this level where I want. Here it's -20, so just a little bit. I don't try to use a ton of LFE on orchestra. Sometimes I don't at all. This big section here. If you're listening on headphones with a lot of low end or on full range speakers, as you probably heard that, that's what that sounds like. It's just that low octave that's just sort of giving a little more foundation to things. On all my buses here, or these are actually master faders for my outputs because I feed everything to a second Pro Tools rig, as you've seen in other videos. I use stem cell here. Honestly, this is really just to filter out the LFE so that nothing is printed in the LFE channel above what I have it set to here, 120, and then it's 24 dB per octave. So that just kind of clears up that. These are all set at 20. Sometimes the surrounds I'll filter out more, but you don't often need to. I mean, I did a low end filter on the surround microphones, and the reverb doesn't usually have too much low end going there. But this is a nice plugin just to sort of a safety, just make sure the stems are clean before I send them to the dub. Yeah, so that's the orchestra. Moving on, we have a bunch of prelays here. So that's the only thing that was live in this. Everything else you hear, the rest of the percussion and obviously the synths and things like that all came from Stephen's rig. The brass stem here, there's nothing going on here since the brass wasn't overdubbed. I have his brass samples here, which I did not use any of them. Similar channel strip to the orchestra here, but for the other sessions, the other episodes, 301 through 309 had brass overdubbed, so that would have gone in here and had similar reverbs and things like that. But it's not used in this cue since the orchestra was recorded all together. PBH is piano, bells, and harps is what that stands for. In some circles, typical stem label, but not in all. It's just at the end here, I believe it's the chimes that I use, because this stem, if I unmute that... Oh, you're right. This was an organ that I believe I had a separate split for because it was married here with a few other things. At the end here, I believe there's a harp in here. Oh, that's the piano. Yeah, so that wasn't used because we had live piano, so I had that muted. That whole channel's not being used, and we just used these bells, which are just chimes. Would have been lovely to have percussion players, but wasn't in the budget from Paramount to have that many more players on this session. Reverbs, I'm just using my usual Symphony piano hall, 2.8 seconds, so it's not super long, but it's in a little bit longer. And then just adding the room. There's a lot more of it here. That's at Unity. The send is -4. Oh, fair amount of room here. So here's with reverb. So yeah, kind of put in the space. I didn't do any bus EQ on this. That's just sitting there waiting for me to use it if I would like. So yeah, that's the sort of bells. Let's move on to percussion. So Orc Perk first was just at the end here. We just had timpani and Orc bass drum. I believe these are the Abbey Road samples. Pretty epic. Turn some EQ on. Just sort of clearing up some low mids on the timpani. Bass drum here got a little bit heavy. So just sort of clearing that up. Verbs, I use another Altiverb room and then cinematic rooms here. This is my typical perk chamber that I use. 2.4 seconds. It's not super long, but it's not super short either. The Altiverb is Fox. I used to use Tadio as well on percussion, but it's kind of fun to have a different room for perk in the mix just to give it a slightly different space. They both work great, but Fox is a great perk room. Somewhat similar to Warner Brothers, probably a little bit more reverberant than Warner Brothers. Certainly not as reverberant as Sony is, though. So here's with some reverb added. So not ultra wet, but just adding some space. The bass drum, of course, I'm setting to that same channel strip here that I had for the sub. And then there is some bus processing. If I turn all this on, well, we'll look at it first. I didn't do any EQ here. I do love to use the Pultec here on my percussion buses. So the this one is just doing the Pultec trick, 60 hertz, one boost, one attenuation, pretty broad bandwidth. So the interesting thing about the Pultec is that the circuitry for the boost and the attenuation circuits are slightly different. I think the boost is a little bit lower and the attenuation is slightly higher. So the boost is like 55 and the attenuation is like 65 or 70 or something like that. So when you do both knobs at the same time, you would think they'd cancel out, but they actually kind of create this little hump and then a little dip above it, which is just a nice thing. It's called the Pultec trick, I believe. So I just use a tiny bit of that on percussion. It just adds a little nice something to the low end. So I'm using that here. And then my typical SSL G compressor on the bus. So here's without compression. And EQ. So that's just kind of evening things out. A fair amount of compression, actually. But this is a very loud section. And you can also see that that's getting rid of our clips there on the masters. So that's the Orc perk. Let's move on to whatever is going on in perk A and B. Let's see. Looks like booms. We have some movement going on here. Sub drum, big drum's low. This is actually kind of light for this show. Some of the cues I had quite a bit of percussion going on and the big action cues and things like that. The brilliant Mark Wenger had programmed a lot of percussion on some cues, but this one I think was just all from Stephen's session. So here's the percussion going on in the middle here. I loved this verby, what is it called? Backbeatage is really kind of fun. Kind of almost a modern version of like the GoldenEye ping and that Eric Serra score. But anyway, that's all the percussion going on there. There's some EQs, just the typical, just sort of clearing up low mids. I don't think we're going to go over every single sound. The most drastic is still less than 4 dB. I don't do any super crazy EQs. You also notice that on individual channels, for the most part, my EQs are almost always subtractive, they're reductive, because I'm just sort of clearing out mid-range, clearing out where there's some resonances, there's some woofiness that I hear, just to kind of clear things up a little bit. I guess it's a good one to listen to. Here's without any bus EQ, or sorry, channel EQ. So just a little clarity. Reverbs, it's the same combination. I think this is the same length, 2.4, and Fox. So let's turn those on. The only new one here that you haven't heard yet is this 250. So this is a EMT 250 reverb, which is a vintage digital reverb. And since there's only the U80 version is only stereo, I actually use two of them here. So I send the same send to both. One's panned in the front, one's panned in the surrounds. And they're set slightly differently. So the front one set to 4 seconds, and then the levers are set that way with the almost longest pre-delay set here. The back one just boosts the RT and the pre-delay a little bit longer, so you get a little bit of extra tail in the back. And then, I found a mistake. So normally I actually switch this to rear outputs. So it's actually a different output because this was a quad reverb when it came out. I'll leave that just for sake of listening to the same thing I actually delivered. Normally I have those flipped. Let's see, on Perk B, do I have it flipped? No. Interesting. So a little oversight there. It doesn't make that big of a difference to the sound. But typically when I set this up, I have front and rear. I might have actually derived this from a 7.1 template where this was actually the side reverb. And then there was another one in the rear that was set that way. But that I'm just using. I don't typically use that reverb on big low perk, but I kind of kept this whole groove together since the Perk B here is all cymbals and cymbal swells and things like that. I figured that was more useful for the dub to have the cymbal swells separate and the tams and stuff, and then have all sort of motory motion stuff. A lot of times that backbeatage, that pingy thing, I'd put on a separate stem, but in this case it's just staying there. But yeah, I added a decent amount of this 250 to that. So here's what it sounds like wet. Yeah, pretty straightforward. And moving on to Perk B here, these are all the whooshes, risers, sheet metal, tam cymbals, anything sort of transition-y or sort of swelly I put on Perk B. I guess we'll look down here. There's a little bit more going on. Here's what these sound like. So same thing here, mostly just filtering, maybe a tiny bit of mid-range smoothing. Maybe it's a little higher. That one has none. These are pretty good sounding samples. A lot of times I'll get cymbal swells from composers that are very bright in the high mids. So I really need to suppress a fair amount of, 3.5, 4K, because when it reaches the peak of it, it just kind of hurts, especially if you're listening at cinematic levels where the cue is played back quite loud. You never want it to hurt. I never want my mixes to hurt, and a lot of times I have to watch out with cymbals and piatti and things like that because they can really be very piercing easily. But these aren't too bad. The tam cymbal here, a little bit up there, but actually the piatti, yeah, I didn't do any of it here. So same sort of reverb allotment here. This might be a little longer. No, that's the same. Okay, so the same reverbs here. They're identical to the other stem, just I have a duplicate of them because the stem needs its own unique reverb. So we'll turn all those on, and then, sorry, I didn't show you the perk here. This has a similar layout on the low perk here. Moving back to perk A real quick. Just sort of reduced, it was getting a little bit heavy in the low end, just with all the, sub drum and booms and things like that. So just a tiny bit, 1.8, I just sort of pulled it down. There we go. It's a little bit clearer. Pultec trick once again. Sometimes if there's an action cue with a lot of moving perk, a lot of big epic perk, I will boost 8K here. It's already ready to go. I just need to turn this knob up. So if I want more bite out of the percussion, it's easy to get this up here, and the bandwidth is pretty broad. But in this case, just started with 0 because there's plenty of that going on. This is a distressor, is something I like to use on action perk. It probably wasn't doing as much on this cue as if there was, a lot of, taikos and surdos and things like that doing a lot of rhythm. But this is basically just a parallel compressor. You can see here the mix is almost dry. So it's just a tiny bit of it, and it's in nuke mode. So let's see if it's actually doing much here. Whoops. So technically quite a bit, but it's only a tiny bit here. I bypass this. Very subtle, especially on this. You're not going to hear it as much, but in an action cue, it just gives a little bit more presence without technically turning the volume up too much. And then again, the SSL compressor. This, a healthy kiss on the peaks there. So that's what's going on there. Back to the cymbals here. Same setup here, though. There's no reason to have the distressor on Perk B because it's not going to do much on cymbals. So I just deactivate it here or bypass it. Deactivate it, sorry. Because I am at 76% usage on my UAD with 2 octo cards. So this is 6 channels of distressor. So I kind of have to, sometimes deactivate certain things to get it all working. But with reverbs, here's all the cymbals wet. So my reverb just kind of smooths it out, gives it a little extra tail, especially in the surrounds, kind of nice big surround reverbs. We'll just get all the percussion going on here. And here's in context. Intentionally delayed in the orchestra there. So there's all the percussion. Not super thick in this cue, but there is some things going on. So let's move on to the synths. So I used I used my 2 synth stems and then the miscellaneous A stem here to split out some synths further. So let's open all of these. And mostly because I did that because there were some synths here, some pads that I wanted on their own for the dub. Actually, it's this organ here. So the organ is what's really blasting through at this moment. These are all the pads, and then here is the synth sub bass that you hear kind of going throughout the 2 big parts of the cue. So let's look at synth A first. Typically, I use synth A for synths, synth B for pads, and then the miscellaneous stems are there for whatever I need. Extra synths, in this case, miscellaneous B we're going to look at is the synth choir that's going on. If there were guitars or a solo or something like that, I like calling those miscellaneous just because, they can be open for whatever. And then, whatever I want to split out further for the dub can be put on those stems. But here's these synth basses in this motor. So yeah, let's hear what that sounds like. So pretty straightforward synth bass here. This one I'm actually sending directly to the sub because it has so much sub frequency that it doesn't really need extra sub harmonics. I don't do a lot of this. This is mostly actually more of a theatrical thing. In home theater, your home theater receiver is probably going to be doing a lot of this sort of bass management style thing, but I want a little bit in the sub, so it's just sort of, it's a decent amount lower than the front channels. This I just sent. I didn't use an unwrapper because there's no point. It's a mono signal. You can see the left and right is the same level. And I just pan it in a little bit. So -87, I just toe it in a little bit. So as you can see here, it's getting a little bit of center channel. So it uses a little bit of that low end driver of the center channel, which again is more of a theatrical technique. But that's what's going on there. The motor, you kind of could hear there was a little bit of high end, just sort of definition. Kind of just adding a little bit where the orchestra gets really big in the middle there. Nice little arrangement technique. EQ-wise, let's see. This one I did have to take a decent amount, for me at least, of low end out, just to it was getting a little bit woofy in the whole mix with the orchestra playing as well. It just got a little heavy, so I just sort of carved out some low end there. This guy barely did anything too. Just a little low mids to sort of blend it in. Reverb-wise, nothing on that sub bass. There's not really any reason to put reverb on a sub bass like that. But the motor, I did use a little bit of Altiverb here. I like to use this Westlake D convolution. I read a book about recording Michael Jackson, the Thriller album at Westlake, And the great Bruce Swedien used to actually reamp all the synths for that album in Westlake D. So he would play the synth tracks out of the loudspeakers that are in there and just record the reverb of the room, which is a really nice tight room, to give the synths a little more life. So most of the synths on Thriller have been reamped, or not reamped, but worldized, to use a Ben Burt term, in Westlake D. So I thought, well, I have a Westlake D convolution. I'll just use that for synths as well, just to give things a little bit of space and kind of spread them around the surrounds a bit. So we'll listen to this motor here with that on. You can hear how short that is, and I'm not really using a ton of it. Other synths I might use a bit more, but that just gave it a little bit of space, kind of spread it out a bit. And then bus-wise on this, I am actually using a Pro MB here to smooth out the low end. So that synth bass was still getting a little bit heavy for me, and some of the notes were maybe a little bit louder sounding than others. So I use this Pro MB. Oh, hey, how that disappears. Just to sort of suppress the low end. Just kind of evens it out. So yeah, I have a preset called PM Bass Softener whenever the low end's a little heavy, but I don't necessarily want to reduce the low end too much because it is a nice weight and a nice warmth. I just use that to just sort of even it out a bit. So that's the ARP synths. Then we have a bunch of pads going on here. So let's take a listen to those. Some detuney stuff, all sorts of things. Put my channel EQs on. So technically, soloed like this, they probably sound a little bit smaller to you, but that's because there's so much going on in this mix right here, especially in the mid-range, that I was just sort of clearing things up. So each one of these is just a little bit of a reduction on the mid-range and some filtering. Some of these I maybe could have just done one scoop here, but I did two. Just sort of clicked around and just sort of, evened all these synths out so that they blended together a little bit better in the whole mix. Reverb-wise, these are my longer reverbs, or some of them are, slightly shorter. This Cinematic Rooms here is my go-to sort of pad. Called it Pad Galaxius because I just started with this Galaxius preset in Cinematic Rooms and then just tweaked it a bit. Can't remember what I did. I made this preset a long time ago. But it's 5.3 seconds, so it's pretty long. So I only use this on really long paddy things, or if you want really, big, long, overt reverb. This Symphony is my typical synth hall short that I'll use on ARP reverbs. It's only 2.29, so I guess a few of these I decided I didn't want super long reverb, but I still wanted space. But here's what that sounds like with Verb. So here's no Verb. And there's with the reverb. So you can hear that's quite long, but just kind of spreads things around. It's really nice, kind of a dreamy sound on those synths. And then bus-wise, I didn't do anything on this. The buses, no EQ, just that. I have this filter just ready to go. It's at 20 hertz. It's not really doing anything. It's just if I want to filter out low end or I need to, it's right there. I can just grab it and just scoop it up. And I haven't any built, some people I think have this fear that if you have too many low frequency filters like this, that there's going to be technically a hump in there. ProQ is pretty good at that. I don't have any 20 hertz buildup going on because I have this EQ on all my buses, so hasn't been a problem for me, if anybody's wondering that. It looks like I actually used, what is this here? Oh, this is why it's a little bit shorter. That's kind of a cool sound. Sort of playing the tonics. So yeah, you can hear that reverb. It's still a big reverb. It's just a lot shorter. So I didn't want that too swimmy at the end there. So yeah, this stem here, since there's not a lot of pads going on, I just split the synth bass from these sort of Jupiter Brahmi things. And then finally, these are the extra pads that I split out. Let's see what those sound like. Just a little bit more of a lead sound, I thought. So I decided to split it out for the dub and for the music editor. And that clustered drone's kind of a really detuney specific sound, so I gave it to them separate just because I had a stem open. Might as well. Turn the EQs on. Again, not a whole ton going on there. You know, this is really where I'm paying attention to on synths. You can see this cluster pad. None of this is needed. That's just garbage. I don't even hear that in here with my big IB2s, my PMCs. So I just filtered that out because there's just no reason to have that in there. I get this from Omnisphere a lot of other synths. There's just a lot of low-end garbage going on. So part of it when I'm going through all these tracks is just rolling off any just low-end rumble crap that doesn't need to be there. That's just, I don't know, for some reason a lot of the plug-in synth instruments have a lot of this here. This is more just a safety. There's not a lot going on there. But just, you know, that was just a little too much in the mix. There you go. It's really not much, you know. -3.7, -2.2. It sounds like a big difference in the mix, but that's what that's doing. Then at the end here, this is really fun. We had this Royal Albert Hall organ. Sort of blasting away, which is really nice. Would have been fun to record live organ, but not in the case for this one. Here's the reverb. I believe this is the same long... Oh, okay, so a little bit shorter. I decided that this didn't need to be quite as soupy as the pads. But still, 4.8's, you know, not short. Oh, actually, sorry, this is actually a different preset. This is the Herculean, which is actually I saved as a vocal preset here, which I typically use if I really want that, you know, wet, dreamy, cinematic vocal. I'll start with that here, but I think it's like 6 seconds or something is what the preset is. So I just pulled it back to 4.8, so it's not quite as dreamy, but that's what's on all these pads and things like that. So that's what that tail sounds like. And finally, last but not least, we have a beautiful synth pad kind of choir thing here that opens up the cue at the very beginning and then kind of plays throughout here and throughout most of the cue. So yeah, we have, it looks like there's 3 choir tracks here and then 2 at the end. Oh, so yeah, just looks like Epic Choir. It's just a different, maybe a different library at the end. So here's what they sound like. This is how the cue starts. Very warm, intimate sound. Here's my channel EQs. So again, just evening out low end because it all adds up. It all builds up in the end. Yeah. Nothing super crazy. Maybe a little bit more crazier. Almost 5 on there because it's just a little bit honky. But nothing too crazy on these two. Because right around here is where the horn solo comes in, so you don't want to conflict too much there. And then add some reverb. This is my typical choir reverb. That's the decay of those reverbs. So for choir, this is that same dreamy vocal reverb that I'm using here. But the Altiverb is actually very long. This Uraniumborg, I believe is how you would say it. I have a lot of Norwegian in my blood, but I'm not actually from there, so I don't speak Norwegian. It's probably pronounced differently. But this is a really nice church reverb that's in a convolution of a cathedral that's in Altiverb that I love to use on choir. I used to use the Notre Dame one, which is also very nice, but also everybody uses that one. So I just one day was sort of just flipping through the different cathedrals, and I thought this one sounded a little bit clearer. The Notre Dame one kind of sits in the background more. This one's a little bit more overt. So I don't think I did anything to this. I just saved it as a. Oh, I might have done a little EQ. No, I didn't even EQ it. So yeah, that's kind of 9-second convolution. Just adds a nice sort of church, cathedral choir kind of vibe. I did do a little bus EQ on this one, just because in the mix there's still some mids building up on the choir here. So here's with that EQ on. We'll just go in the middle here. Again, pretty subtle, but just kind of helps clear up the mix a bit. And here's in context. Yeah, and that's everything. So that's all the elements that make up this cue. Let me just double check that I did turn everything back on. All the reverbs are unmuted. All the plugins are on. I think this is back to, should be exactly the same as it was when I printed it for the show. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. So that's all the elements in the mix. Now I'm going to show you basically the final sort of step that goes on my other Pro Tools rig that you see over here. So if I go in my I/O here, let's maximize that. I have all the stems here. So these are all the stems. These buses here are going out DigiLink to my matrix. So I have an Avid matrix that has 128 channels of both Pro Tools rigs via DigiLink. So there's 3 DigiLink cards within that, and then the built-in DigiLink connectors to give me 128 channels per rig directly to the matrix. I don't need MADI box or anything anymore. So that's all of these channels here. These edit channels here are just so I could pass through any edited stems without any processing to be summed over on the print side. So that goes out the matrix and literally just bust right across to the second Pro Tools rig, which we'll look at here. This is my the session that's on the second rig over here. You can see here this is the final print of this cue as it was. Whoops, that key command doesn't work correctly. All right, so if I zoom in here, you can see this is where all of the stems that were printed. I also print a full 5-1 mix, a stereo fold down live, and then this dialogue slug is literally just the dialogue bust over so that the music editor, if there is a conform to be done, has basically a print of how the dialogue was playing back while I mixed it. It makes it really easy for them to visually see against the new guide track if the things moved around at all. Then the click, and I print the click just, if a music editor needs to do a musical edit, it's easy for them to review the click, especially in a cue like this where there's not a lot of really obvious percussion. Sometimes can be helpful. It's just nice to have, so I print it for really for the music editors. So this session, you can see here, this is the whole episode of 310. I print into an A-B roll like this, so all the cues are checkerboarded like this. Makes it really easy for the music editor once they get a session from me that it's sort of all built like this, and then they can carry on with all the other things that they need to do. I've already kind of built a session for the episode. So everything comes into these buses here. These inputs here are what's coming from the other Pro Tools rig. In this case, they're just hitting this Studer A800. I really like this GP9. I trim the input back and correct the gain with the output here, because sometimes if the choir gets really loud or like really heavy percussion, sometimes you get a little bit of tape distortion that's not nice. So I'm careful with that. I have it at 30 IPS, so I'm not really affecting the high end at all. I might have tweaked these years ago, the high frequency and low frequency driver, but it just, and then I turn off all the noise. I don't need tape hiss. It's 2023. I'm not really a tape hiss fan. So I have those across all my stems here. And actually here, maybe I can actually give it, it's a very, very subtle change. But that actually is partially maybe why I need to do a lot of low mid cuts and things like that, is because when this is playing back, with these on here, it does do some of the low end that sometimes needs a little balancing, but I'll play this big section and bypass and unbypass these tape saturators. So it's incredibly subtle, but in here, I don't know, it feels like I hear a little bit more depth, a little bit more width. The high end's a little smoother or just a little nicer. When I played around with this years ago, everything sounded just slightly better to me, but it wasn't too big of a change because I don't want it to be doing too much. So pretty much all my projects have that. Sometimes I'll change, like Cobra Kai, I'll use the 456 tape stock here. It's got a little bit different of a color to it, but GP9 is, what they would have probably used back in the day for scoring sessions when they recorded orchestra to tape. And then here's those edit stems that come in. They sum together to these buses, just a safety limiter. There's no gain, just a -1 true peak. It's literally just so that nothing clips. So then all of those channels go over here. They input to these stems here. All the stems record. The stems route back here to this 5-1 mix bus. They go back over here and they sum here at the 5-1 mix bus. Literally, it's just a limiter, -1 dynamic. Sometimes I set this to transparent. Pro L2 is a little bit nicer sounding when you push into it. The Pro limiters I use here because literally they're just catching peaks. Sometimes if I have a really loud cue, I'm getting a little bit more gain reduction on the Pro L2, and I find that the Pro L2 is a lot smoother. Like if I'm mixing EDM or dance or trap or something like that, and I really need to limit heavily, Pro L2 retains the low end and sort of the character a bit more. So sometimes I'll do this. Just to save resources, I'll just use the Easy, which is still a great sounding limiter in from Pro Tools from Avid for the stems, and then the full mixes here sum through this Pro L2. The exact same 5-1 mix goes to another bus here that gets folded down with this Nugent Halo down mix plugin. I A/B'd it against the down mixer from Avid. I thought it sounded a little bit better. Maybe it doesn't. I thought it did, and I had it, so I use it. I feel like it does sound a little bit better. I trimmed back the center channel by 3. Everything's down by 3 globally here, so just add 3 to everything. So it's -3. The left and right is at the -3 just unity level. The LFE I also leave at the same level, which is unconventional, but I specifically use my LFE for subharmonics, so I want it in there. And then the surrounds are -6 relative to the front channels. That's my typical fold down algorithm on the fly, which is pretty similar to what your home theater receiver would do, or what a lot of software will do on the home end. Taking a surround mix and crashing it down. Usually they'll actually either ditch the LFE completely or sometimes put it at -10 because they don't want to have a limiter circuit built into your DVD player, or Blu-ray player or home theater receiver. Then that goes into a limiter here. There is a little gain here just to bring back. Basically, I did this just to give me a little headroom. That's why I have all of these faders pulled back by -3. Then you gain it back a little bit there, and then that both these full mixes bust back here and print to the 5-1 mix and the stereo fold down. And then in here, so that I can hear my full mix, this is actually what we're monitoring. So this goes back out. If you look at the I/O here, the output here just goes back to the matrix and gets rerouted back to my main session here, where I have this return fader over here that literally is just passing through the mix that's summing on the second rig so that I can monitor it. So if I were to mute this, you would hear nothing at all. That's where the entire mix comes back. So I'm hearing what the stems sum together through the tape saturation altogether sounds like while I'm working. That's what I'm listening to. Now, as I always do, we'll just play back the final mix, and I'll A/B against Stephen's reference mix, and I'll scroll around so you can see what's going on. But here is the final mix of 310M16 Picard Saves Jack, which is the missing part of me on the soundtrack album. Here you go. And there you have it. There's the final mix of The Missing Part of Me from episode 310 of Star Trek Picard. You might have noticed here I did turn back on my global automation here. So this is just the global fader ride that I did on the orchestra. I did really have to bring them up quite a bit at the beginning of this section here to get the string theme going on, and I did do a little boost here in the viola spots, it looks like, just to get their line coming out. And then the harp was also boosted in this section just so you could hear her playing throughout. Otherwise, I don't believe I did a whole lot of other spot mic automation. No, that's the only spot mic automation I did. Everything else, all my automation is just global. So this is the entire orchestra here, sort of the master VCA, just sort of riding the level throughout the cue. Just to give a little breath, breathe in and out, kind of riding with the dynamics, and then making sure that it's at an appropriate level with the rest of the prelays. And then I did the same thing on Orc 2 here, which is that short string overdub we went over earlier. So yeah, there's the mix. I hope you all enjoyed this walkthrough of how I mixed this one cue. The rest of the show was mixed relatively similarly. I might do a video on the end credits, which is basically almost essentially just this multi-track of the orchestra with really not a whole lot of automation. It's just sort of the recording playing back with my static mix and some global automation, and then some perk stems. So I did this cue instead because it had some synths and some more interesting mixing techniques going on other than just straight up orchestra. But it's really not a whole lot different than this was. So yeah, be sure to watch season 3 of Star Trek Picard. It's streaming now on Paramount Plus. The soundtrack is available on Apple Music, Spotify, iTunes. There is a vinyl release coming out as well. It's a slightly less number of tracks because it could only fit so much onto 2 vinyl records versus the entire digital release. But yeah, check it out and enjoy. Thanks for watching.